Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a very important column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column deals with the topic of politicization of our police forces and the urgent need for police reforms in the country. This column has been written in the context of recent developments involving the Mumbai police, wherein the Mumbai police commissioner was removed in a very controversial manner by the Maharashtra government. See, in India, the subject of police falls under the state list as per the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. So, in a constitutional democracy, the elected state governments they need to exercise superintendence and political accountability over the police forces, including over the police chiefs, such as city police commissioners, and as well as over the highest ranking police officer in the state, that is the DGP of the state. But this power of the government to decide upon the appointment and removal of police chiefs has resulted in the politicization of our police forces. When police chiefs, such as commissioners or DGPs, are appointed or removed, there is no independent, transparent process that is followed, but instead, every state government has been following a very opaque process with hardly any scope for independent verification. This has allowed the state governments to push their political appointees into key positions in the police forces, thereby leading to excessive politicization of our police forces. Such politicization of the police force by the political class affects its independence and its operational efficiency. In a democracy, while the police chiefs are supposed to be held politically accountable by the elected government, at the same time, they need to be provided with the required operational autonomy in order to keep the police force independent and effective. But this key aspect of police administration has been severely compromised in India, and state governments do not follow any independent vetting process to assess the suitability of qualified candidates. And even if any government assessment is carried out, it remains very opaque. And even though the state governments have been mandated by the Supreme Court to guarantee a security of tenure of 2 years to key positions such as DGP of the state, state governments continue to blatantly violate these provisions and they continue to remove police chiefs from their positions at their whims and fancies. So, this discretionary power of appointment and removal, which is entirely opaque, has directly compromised the operational independence of the police force, and it has made the police chiefs subservient to the elected government. It is in this context that the writer raises a key aspect of police reforms, which is to have an independent oversight body in place to provide for the selection and appointment of police chiefs, and the need for establishing a transparent decision making process and objective criteria based on which police chiefs can be appointed and removed from their positions. In this column, the writer addresses these two key aspects of police reforms, which can help in promoting the political neutrality of our police forces. The National Police Commission, or also known as the Dharamveer Commission, which was set up in 1979, was the first committee to make such a recommendation for establishing a state-level independent oversight body with a specified role in the appointment and removal of police chiefs. Later, in the landmark Prakash Singh case of 2006, the Supreme Court reaffirmed this and it entrusted the UPSC with a role in shortlisting the suitable candidates. And even the Model Police Bill of 2015 recommended the establishment of a multi-party state police board, which would be referred to as the State Security Commission, which would have representation not just for the government, but also for the leader of opposition, and as well as for independent members from the civil society. Such a multi-party state security commission was expected to provide independent oversight over the appointment and removal process of police chiefs. Currently, around 26 states and union territories have established such a state security commission, but there are critical gaps in their functioning. The biggest shortcoming of these state security commissions, which have been set up by few states and union territories, is that they are still dominated by the political executive, and some states have failed to include the leader of opposition or civil society members. And in those states where they have been included, the State Security Commission is still dominated by the government, that is, by the political executive. And in states where the State Security Commission has been set up, many of them haven't met. And this clearly shows that there is a structural design flaw in the composition and constitution of these state security commissions. And this will have to be rectified through police reforms if we have to introduce any meaningful changes. Then, more importantly, in almost 23 states, the state governments have complete discretion in the appointment of the police chiefs. With the exception of Assam, Jharkhand, Karnataka, Meghalaya, and Mizoram, in all the other major states, state governments have complete discretion in deciding upon the appointment and removal of police chiefs. Even in these states where the governments do not enjoy sole discretion, the safeguard mechanisms exist only on paper, but in reality, even these state governments are not following a transparent, verifiable, and independent process in the appointment and removal of police chiefs. Then, if you look at the existing decision making process and the criteria that is used, you will find that the state governments have been directed by the Supreme Court in the Prakash Singh case and as well as by the provisions of the Model Police Bill to follow the recommendations of the UPSC, which will decide upon suitable candidates by looking at basic criteria such as the length of service, the service record of the officer, his range of experience, performance appraisal, etc. Apart from these general criteria, there is no specific guideline on how the UPSC and the state governments should arrive at a pool of candidates from whom the police chiefs can be selected. For example, how do you define as to what is a good length of service? Or what qualifies as a good range of experience? Then how do you measure and quantify the integrity of a candidate? How do you check whether a candidate is truly politically neutral? And is there a need to hold personal interviews while appointing officers for crucial positions? Such specific criteria and guidelines are missing. And as a result, when you don't have an objective criteria against which you are assessing the candidates, you will end up making the decision-making process very opaque, and thus the discretion enjoyed by the state governments will become liable for misuse. So the need of the hour is to put in place a transparent, independent, and verifiable decision-making process that is made on the basis of objective criteria. And these decisions should not be left to the sole discretion of the government. Instead, it should be made by an independent oversight body that provides ample representation for opposition parties and as well as for the members of civil society. This is where the writer suggests that India needs to look up to the UK model when it comes to police appointments. In 2011, the United Kingdom introduced the Police Reforms and Social Responsibility Act, under which the proposed candidates who are set to be appointed as police chiefs, they need to undergo a public confirmation hearing. The proposed candidates and the shortlisted candidates, they need to appear for a public confirmation hearing in front of representatives of local councils, which provides representation for independent experts from the civil society and the local people. And the shortlisted candidates, they need to prove their political neutrality to these local councils. Finally, based on the findings of this public confirmation hearing, there is an appointment panel which decides upon the appointments. And if two-thirds of the members of this panel vote against a particular officer, then he or she cannot be appointed, as they would have doubts about the political neutrality of that officer. Then even with regard to removal of police chiefs in the UK, they cannot be removed at the whims and fancies of the government. The police chief in question will be given an opportunity in front of the panel to respond to any allegations and accusations, thus bringing more fairness and transparency to the removal process as well. Here we need to recollect the findings of the Supreme Court in the T.P. Sen Kumar case of 2017, where the Supreme Court emphasized that prima facie satisfaction of the government alone is not a sufficient ground to justify removal from a tenure post in government. The Supreme Court observed in this case that rule of law requires such decisions to be made on compelling grounds and on the basis of verifiable material evidence which can be objectively tested in a court of law. So such measures will have to be considered by India as a part of its police reforms if we need to maintain the political neutrality of our police forces, because otherwise the excessive politicization of police will simply demoralize the force and it will also cripple rule of law. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 6, which deals with the topic of racial discrimination. See, studies around the world have clearly indicated that the existence of racial discrimination and racial stereotyping in a society will always lead to racial violence, racial injustice, and even police brutality against the minorities. This topic comes up in the context of a major development in the United States, where a white police officer has been convicted of second degree and third degree murder and manslaughter for killing an unarmed African American last year known as George Floyd. In this particular incident, George Floyd, who belongs to the racial black minority of the United States, was being detained by police officers on the basis of a petty suspicion. While attempting to detain him, one of the white police officers, Mr. Derek Chauvin, used excessive force against the suspect and placed him in a fatal chokehold, which resulted in his unfortunate death. This incident triggered massive protests across the US because this incident of a white police officer using excessive unnecessary force against an unarmed black individual was seen as an outcome of the persisting racial discrimination and racial divide in the American society. This triggered a massive uprising across the US termed as the Black Lives Matter protests. And now the conviction of this officer and the observations made by the judiciary that this killing was an outcome of racism and racial stereotyping has global ramifications. See, racism as a social evil is not just limited to the United States or to the Western societies. In a narrower sense, racism is often limited to discrimination on the grounds of race and color. But however, in a broader sense, racism could transcend this and it could cover the discrimination of minorities on the lines of ethnicity, religion, or caste by the majority privileged class. Under this broader definition, we can say that racism is very much prevalent even in the Indian society. Because even in India, religious minorities, lower castes, and people belonging to certain regions, they often face discrimination, which ends up resulting in violence, injustice, and police brutality against them. And it is this dehumanizing aspect of racism which makes it a social evil. Under racism, you have a majority class or a majority community discriminating against a minority based on their looks, their behavior, their customs and practices, which eventually results in their dehumanization. To understand this, you look at how slaves were treated by the colonial rulers. Look at how the Jews were stereotyped and targeted by the Nazis. Or look at how native Africans were targeted by the white ruling elite in South Africa under the oppressive and discriminatory apartheid system. Or look at how religious and caste minorities in India are targeted and how a systemic discrimination exists against them. When such discrimination is deep rooted in the society, it results in stereotyping of the minority groups, which also translates into profiling against them by the police authorities and even by the criminal justice system, which eventually results in violence, assaults, and brutality against them. In societies where such discrimination exists, you will find that the police system and the whole criminal justice system is unfairly biased against the minorities, and we often witness false charges being filed against them based on blanket assumptions against minorities, which is a result of stereotyping and profiling. For example, the Nazis carried out a propaganda against the Jews to project them as monsters or devils or dangerous. The black minorities in the United States and as well as in Western Europe are always assumed by the police and the justice system that they often break the law and resort to crimes including theft, robbery, and murders. In India as well, certain minorities are presumed to be unhygienic or unclean, and on such lines, several stereotypes are propagated against the minorities. When this discrimination and stereotype becomes deep rooted in the society, It results in the overall bias of the system, which eventually translates to violence against these communities, especially state-led violence, followed by the failure of the judiciary to secure justice to these affected victims. See, apart from the issue of racial discrimination, the George Floyd incident should also be seen from the perspective of police brutality and accountability. This is yet another issue that India battles with because quite often Indian police is known to discriminate against religious minorities, caste minorities, and as well as against people belonging to certain regions. It is quite common for Indian police to be more brutal when they are dealing with Dalits or religious minorities. The same has been noted when the accused or suspect is from northeastern states or from backward states such as UP or Bihar. Even in India's conflict hit zones such as Jammu and Kashmir, northeastern states, and the Naxal corridor, religious and ethnic minorities are often targeted by the police and security forces. And this raises the question of the extent of immunity that should be granted to police and security forces versus the extent to which they should be held accountable for their misconduct and for any violations of the law. Yes, it is a very valid argument that police and security forces do require a certain degree of immunity, especially from false charges, because otherwise, police and security forces won't be able to function and operate in a fearless and independent manner. This is very true with regard to conflict zones, where security forces require additional immunity and protection in the form of controversial laws such as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. But however, these laws should also provide for accountability to charge and punish any guilty officers or rogue officers who might be committing such grave acts of brutality against the minorities, which includes arrests based on false assumptions, torture, killings, and in all such cases of police misconduct, the guilty officers should be punished strictly in order to hold the entire force accountable. So the key is to strike a balance between the extent of immunity and the extent of accountability. And for this, you need police reforms. This is where India again can learn a lesson from the United States. Because right now, President Joe Biden has pushed a bill known as the Police Reform Bill, following the national outrage after the George Floyd incident. And through this bill, the United States is looking to reform its police forces to ensure that the police forces become free of their racial biases. This proposed bill bans several questionable tactics employed by the police forces, including a ban on chokeholds. But at the same time, it guarantees qualified immunity in legitimate cases where the security forces require certain degree of legal protection. It also establishes a national standard for policing through which existing racial biases are filtered out during training, which will help in ensuring that the police force is racially neutral. And this proposed bill also provides for greater accountability and provides a legal route for holding guilty officers accountable by delivering the strictest of punishments, which will help in setting an example for the entire force. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, in which the writer evaluates as to how in a hyper-connected world, data is going to define the new global world order. See, over the last 3 decades, the center of global geopolitics has shifted from the Atlantic Ocean towards the Indo-Pacific region. This shift in the focal point of geopolitics has been driven by the rapid rise of China along with other Asian powers, followed by the simultaneous decline of Western powers, especially European economies. So this change in world order brings China into direct competition with the United States, both in terms of economic conflict and as well as in terms of military conflict. So in this world, the writer says that data is going to drive the definition of the new world order because in the fourth stage of the industrial revolution that we are currently witnessing, data is going to be the key driver of innovation, and it is already establishing itself as the foundation for trade and as well as for ensuring national security. The rapid rise and acceptance of e-commerce and as well as the rise of digital payments and digital transactions, along with the emergence of social media and big tech, has made the global economy to become heavily dependent on data. Parallelly, the national security of any country has become closely related to data security, as it is directly associated with cybersecurity and cyber wars, and the rising weaponization of data and the increasing cyber warfare capabilities of several countries has eroded conventional deterrence, thereby making data and control over data critical for a country's economic and as well as national security. So, in this emerging conflict between the two major powers of the world, that is US and China, the fight for control over data is going to be at the very center of this conflict, and both the sides have their own advantages and drawbacks. While China has already emerged as a world leader in e commerce and as well as with regard to digital payments, it still lags behind with regard to production of semiconductors, as China is still dependent on other countries to an extent. And China is yet to figure out a way to bypass the American hegemony on the global banking and financial system, which the US controls through its sanctions regime. Then China is also at a disadvantage with regard to the rapid strides that American companies have made in cloud computing and big tech. But the US, on the other hand, even though it enjoys a conventional technological dominance over China, it severely lags behind China in the digital world, especially with regard to digital payments. If you look at the adoption of a digital ecosystem, China is way ahead of the United States, and China's mobile payments market stands at $53 trillion in transactions. Even India's digital payment system, driven by the UPI interface, stands at a transaction value of around $1 trillion, whereas the United States is far behind both India and China, and hardly around 100 billion worth of transaction takes place in the US through its digital payment system. Along with that, China already has taken a step ahead of the other countries with regard to cryptocurrencies or digital currencies, and it has even come out with its own digital yuan. So, in this hyper connected world where everything is driven by data, India finds itself caught between two major powers, that is, the United States and China. On one hand, India is an immediate neighbor of China, and we not only have a standing border dispute, but we also have an active strategic competition that goes on between the two countries. But with the US, India does enjoy close strategic and defense relations, and ideologically speaking, India is more aligned with the United States. The US as well is more comfortable to bring India under its fold in order to create a joint alliance of sorts to target China. But at the same time, interestingly, for both India and US, China happens to be one of their largest trading partners. And of course, China cannot ignore the fact that both India and US represent massive markets on which the Chinese economy itself is dependent. So, considering these complex dynamics of a hyper-connected world that is being driven by data, the writer says that India has a key role to play in defining the future rules of the digital world. And instead of choosing sides between US and China, India would be better served if it maintains a consistent distance from US and China. And by balancing the two powers, India should continue striving towards becoming the second largest economy of the world. So, this ongoing strategic and economic competition over data between the three largest economies is going to define the future of the global world order. Now, let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: discuss the need to strengthen the process of choosing the police chief. The second question: examine how racial discrimination breeds racial injustice. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So, this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.